Ruby?
Hi, Mark. A lot of people talk about desensitizing a dog to something that upsets them, um, and you have thoughts on that. And I'm curious what you think about the use of desensitization when helping a dog overcome its issues with a particular stimulus.
Sure. Well, frankly, it's a tool or an idea that has a dismal success rate, for starters. I'm not sure if there's anything that human doctors recommend so often that has such a failure rate as desensitization. So that's just a basic thing. Why would you keep recommending something that doesn't work much? And I think the basic answer is because people typically don't have a better idea. We do. That's what we call perception modification. But let's talk about some reasons why it doesn't work well. The first thing is, if you want to desensitize a dog to a stimulus, typically in order to be successful, you'd really have to have control over the intensity of the stimulus and when and where it's going to happen. So as an example, with your doorbell, you don't have a remote volume control for your doorbell, or probably any volume control. So when the doorbell rings, and it sounds like it sounds. Now you certainly can do things like using recorded sound for something like that, whether it's a YouTube video or you've recorded your actual doorbell and you can play it back a lot and you can play it at low levels and that kind of thing. But it's difficult to do. And as an example, if you happen to live near the railroad tracks and your dog is afraid of the train, you simply can't desensitize the dog to it. If it was going to happen, it would have just happened. So a lot of times it just is impractical to try and have the mechanism to make it work. Another thing is, just think about that in your life. Think about the food that you dislike the most or the music that you dislike the most. So two things that often get picked on here are Brussels sprouts and opera. But think about whatever you really dislike. If you really hate Brussels sprouts and I keep serving you Brussels sprouts with dinner, at what point do you become desensitized to that and all of a sudden you go, actually, I don't mind Brussels sprouts?
Yeah, no, I'd hate you for serving me Brussels sprouts.
You'd probably try to find someplace else to go eat.
Yeah.
Unfortunately for your dog, fortunately for us, it doesn't really have the option of going somewhere else. But that'll give you kind of an idea. Likewise, if you really hate opera, how much do I have to play opera for you before all of a sudden you change your mind and you go, gee, I don't know why I didn't like opera before.
Yeah,
right?
I don't see that happening either.
Right, it's not likely to happen. So desensitization is a fairly impractical idea. It's a very unpleasant process for the dog if you do it. You're, by definition, taking something the dog doesn't like and repeatedly exposing it to it. You almost got that, huh? And repeatedly exposing it to it with the hope that, like you and Brussels sprouts, one day the dog's going to go, I actually like Brussels sprouts. This really can be a prison camp kind of mentality. If you got served food with maggots every day and that was the only thing you had to eat, you'd eventually eat food with maggots. And you'd probably even act like, God, I can't wait till the food gets here because you're starving. But I guarantee you, as soon as you get out of prison and you go someplace, you're like, I'm never eating food with maggots again. Not only that, you're not going to eat the food that had the maggots. If it was rice, you're probably done with rice for the rest of your life. So it's really kind of a crazy concept. It's a really unpleasant thing for the dog. It's really frustrating for the people, and just very rarely works. So we recommend perception modification. We have another video that talks about perception modification. Probably worth saying up front, these are not instructional videos. We can't teach you in 5 minutes how to do that. That's what we do in our seminars, and we have online versions of our seminars that you can watch if you want to. But this is really to talk about the idea. So, if you've been going around telling everybody in the world they need to desensitize their dog to something, or somebody's been telling you you need to just desensitize your dog to something, and you're really frustrated by its success rate, when you think about those examples we gave, pretty obvious why it doesn't work, and you might want to look for something better.
Well, in listening to you talk, I'm reminded of my own little beagle who, I figured would eventually do better by going to daycare or by being exposed to a whole bunch of things. And
you mean the one that was really afraid of everything?
Yeah, my very fearful one. Yeah. And ultimately those things, after 2 years of daycare and interacting with people, she really didn't feel much better about it. So,
well, in fact, what dogs can actually start doing is what's called back chaining. Back chaining is where they learn that something that they feel neutrally about, or even potentially something they like, leads to something they don't like.
Mm-hmm.
And for those well-educated trainers out there, that would be the exact opposite of the pre-MAC principle. It's a really bad idea to reverse that. But as an example, the dog can get to where it becomes afraid of going in the car, because going to the car is how it ends up at daycare, where it's afraid of all the other dogs and it's afraid of all the people. And daycare would be an example that sometimes works with desensitization. If you have a dog that's really not comfortable with other dogs, you know, you take it there, you put it in other situations, it's possible a few weeks later, a few months later, the dog now feels good about them. But it's also possible for it not to work. And if it doesn't work relatively quickly, in all likelihood it's not going to. And this is an example of what I mean. This can be a really torturous process for the dog. If you're doing this with a dog for whom it's not going to work, you're just repeatedly exposing it to something that it thinks is just terrible. And so I think, you know, desensitization, if it's going to work on a dog with a given situation, it's going to work pretty quickly, or it's not going to work at all. And if it doesn't work, it's really, really awful for the dog, and it's super frustrating for the owner. The other thing that, of course, is always tied to that is counter conditioning. I guess we'll talk about that in another video, but those two are always lumped together, counter conditioning and desensitization. And they're two separate things that are often thrown together as one, but neither has a very good track record of working. The other thing that's really important to think about, you as an example might desensitize your dog to a particular stimulus in a particular situation, like for example your doorbell. But if you go visit family for the weekend, the work you did in desensitizing your dog to your doorbell at home very likely will not carry over to, you know, your mother-in-law's house that you're staying at, and the dog their experience there. So that's another frustration. You can put a lot of time and effort into it. I mean, a lot of time and effort. And even if you have some success, the success doesn't generalize well.
So what you're really saying is you're almost starting over and over and over.
Often completely starting over. That's one of the frustrations with counter conditioning and desensitization. And this is particularly a problem if you have a dog that has a lot of what we call triggers, a lot of different things that upset it. You tend to have to do this process individually for each thing that the dog doesn't like. And each thing may mean your doorbell at home and your relative's doorbell when you go there, or people coming in your front door versus people coming in their front door. So it can be very, very frustrating. In fact, you know, some of the extreme examples you see of this of dogs that are very sensitive and don't generalize well is a dog that may do okay going to a particular dog park, and it takes a long time, maybe 6 months, maybe a year, for them to get pretty comfortable with that. And you take them to a different dog park, and often they're pretty close to back to square one. So it can be a very frustrating process for dogs and for people, and that's why we like to use perception modification, because it works quite quickly and it generalizes extremely well and extremely quickly.
Thank you.